I never thought the words that would break my heart would come from the mouth of a 7-year-old boy, my grandson, the child I had rocked to sleep when he was a baby, whose first steps I had celebrated, whose scraped knees I had kissed better countless times. But there I stood, in what used to be my son's living room, though it felt foreign now, redecorated with expensive furniture I couldn't afford, and photos where my face had been carefully cropped out or replaced, holding a wrapped gift and wearing the forced smile I'd perfected over the past 3 years since David remarried. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I whispered to little Tommy, extending the carefully chosen toy truck I'd found at 3 different stores before settling on the perfect one. The same bright red color as the fire truck we used to play with in my backyard, back when I was still welcome in his world. The room fell silent. Not the comfortable silence of family gathering for celebration, but the cold, expectant quiet that comes when people are waiting for something unpleasant to happen. My son David stood by the kitchen counter, his arms crossed, not meeting my eyes. His wife Jennifer, though I still struggled to think of her as Tommy's stepmother, rather than the woman who had systematically erased me from my own family's life, watched with that barely concealed smirk she wore whenever she thought she was about to witness my humiliation. The other parents at the party, people I didn't recognize, strangers who had become Tommy's new extended family while I had been relegated to the status of unwelcome visitor, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They could sense the tension, even if they didn't understand its source. Tommy looked at the wrapped present in my hands, then up at my face, with eyes that should have held the innocent joy of childhood, but instead carried a coldness I had never seen before. Eyes that had been taught to see me as something other than the grandmother who had once been his favorite person in the world. "The best gift would be if you just died." The words hit me like physical blows. Each syllable landed with devastating precision in the space between my ribs, where my heart was still foolishly hoping for a different outcome, still believing that blood ties and years of love could overcome whatever poison had been dripped into this child's ear day after day, month after month. The room erupted in laughter, not shocked gasps or uncomfortable murmurs, but genuine laughter, as if a 7-year-old wishing death upon his grandmother was the most amusing thing they'd heard all day. Jennifer's laugh was the loudest, a sound of pure triumph that confirmed what I'd suspected for 3 years, but had been too afraid to fully acknowledge. This had all been orchestrated. My son, my only child, the boy I had raised alone after his father left, the young man I had supported through college by working double shifts and eating ramen noodles for dinner, didn't even flinch. He didn't correct his stepson. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look ashamed. He just stood there, passive and complicit, as if his mother-deserving death was a perfectly reasonable sentiment for a child to express at his birthday party. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment with which city you're watching from. I stood frozen, the wrapped present still extended toward a child who had just expressed that my death would bring him joy. The toy truck inside, a vehicle meant to inspire imagination and adventure, suddenly felt heavy in my hands, weighted with the innocence that had been stolen from both of us in different ways. This was the moment I realized that everything I had thought I knew about love, family, and the bonds that supposedly couldn't be broken had been an illusion. I wasn't just losing my grandson, I had already lost him. The child standing before me was a stranger who had been taught to see my existence as an inconvenience, my love as an intrusion, my very presence as something to be endured rather than cherished. The silence that followed the laughter was somehow worse than the cruel words themselves. It was the silence of a family that had moved on without me, that had rewritten our history to cast me as the villain in a story where I had once been the hero. It was the silence of people who had collectively decided that a grandmother's heart was expendable, that her years of sacrifice and devotion could be erased with enough repetition of carefully crafted lies. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab my son by the shoulders and demand to know how he could stand there while his child, our child, the continuation of our family line, wished for my death. I wanted to shake Jennifer and force her to admit what she had done, how she had manipulated an innocent boy into becoming a weapon against the woman who had once changed his diapers and sung him lullabies. But I did none of those things. Instead, I carefully placed the wrapped present on the coffee table, the same table where Tommy and I used to do puzzles together during the brief golden period after David's divorce, but before his remarriage, when I thought I might actually have a chance to be the grandmother I had always dreamed of being. "Happy birthday, Tommy," I said quietly, my voice somehow steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. Then I turned and walked toward the door, my dignity intact even as my heart shattered into pieces so small I wasn't sure they could ever be reassembled. Behind me, the party resumed as if nothing had happened, as if a child's wish for his grandmother's death was just another amusing moment to be forgotten by the time the cake was served. As if I had never been there at all. The drive home from Tommy's birthday party felt endless, even though I lived only 15 minutes away from the house where my son had built his new life. 15 minutes that used to feel like nothing when I was rushing over to babysit, bringing homemade cookies, or simply stopping by to see my grandson's latest drawing or hear about his day at school. Now those same 15 minutes stretched like hours, filled with the echo of a 7-year-old's voice wishing for my death. I kept the radio off, needing the silence to process what had just happened. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I replayed the scene over and over, searching for some explanation that would make sense of how love could transform into such cruelty. How a child who used to run to me with arms outstretched, shouting, "Grandma Carla," with pure joy, could look me in the eye and express that my absence from this world would be his greatest gift. It hadn't always been this way. For the first 4 years of Tommy's life, I had been his second mother. When David was still married to Linda, Tommy's biological mother, I was woven into the fabric of their daily lives in ways that felt natural and necessary. I picked Tommy up from daycare when both parents were working late. I kept him overnight when they needed date nights or weekend getaways. I was the one he called when he had nightmares, the one who knew exactly how to cut his sandwiches and which stories made him laugh. Linda and I had our differences, what mother and daughter-in-law don't, but we shared a common goal, Tommy's happiness and well-being. She trusted me with her son because she could see the genuine love in my interactions with him, the way his face lit up when I walked into a room, the comfort he found in my arms when the world felt too big or too scary. But then came the divorce. David and Linda's marriage had been struggling for years, weighed down by financial stress, conflicting career ambitions, and the simple reality that they had married too young and grown into incompatible people. The divorce itself was painful but civil, with shared custody arrangements that allowed Tommy to maintain relationships with both sides of his family. For about a year after the divorce, things continued much as they had before. I remained Tommy's consistent grandmother, the stable presence in his life while his parents navigated their new arrangements. If anything, my role became more important during that transitional period. Tommy needed extra reassurance, extra love, extra proof that some relationships in his life wouldn't change even when his parents' marriage had ended. Then David met Jennifer. At first, she seemed pleasant enough, polite, interested in Tommy, supportive of David's role as a father. She asked appropriate questions about Tommy's routine, his preferences, his relationship with his mother. She even seemed to appreciate my involvement in his life, thanking me for the stability I provided during such a difficult time. "I'm so grateful Tommy has you," she said during one of our early meetings, her smile warm and seemingly genuine. "It's wonderful that he has such a loving grandmother to depend on. I hope we can work together to make sure he feels secure and loved." I believed her. I wanted to believe her. After watching my son struggle through his divorce and the challenges of single parenthood, I was relieved to see him with someone who appeared to understand and value family relationships. Jennifer seemed like the kind of woman who would enhance our family dynamics rather than disrupting them. The changes began subtly, so gradually that I didn't recognize them as deliberate tactics until much later. It started with schedule conflicts. Suddenly, family gatherings I had been attending for years were moved to times when I couldn't participate. Tommy's soccer games were rescheduled to coincide with my work hours. Birthday parties and holiday celebrations happened on dates when I had prior commitments that everyone knew about weeks in advance. "Oh, I'm so sorry you can't make it," Jennifer would say with apparent sincerity. "We tried to coordinate with everyone's schedules, but it's so difficult to find times that work for everybody. Maybe next time will be better." But next time was never better. There was always some conflict, some impossibility, some reason why the family events that had once included me now somehow always excluded me. When I tried to discuss alternative dates or times, I was told that too many other people had already committed, that it would be unfair to change plans just for one person, that perhaps I needed to be more flexible with my own schedule if family was really a priority for me. The message was clear, even if it was never stated directly. My presence was optional, my convenience irrelevant, my feelings expendable. Next came the subtle undermining of my relationship with Tommy. Jennifer began introducing new traditions, new routines, new people who gradually displaced my role in his life. Where I had once been his primary babysitter, Jennifer's mother took over that responsibility. Where I had once been his go-to person for comfort and advice, Jennifer positioned herself as the primary female authority figure in his world. "We think it's important for Tommy to have consistency," David explained when I questioned why my babysitting services were no longer needed. "Jennifer's mom is retired, so she's more available, and it's easier for Tommy if he doesn't have to adjust to different caregivers." Different caregivers. As if I were some hired help rather than his grandmother. As if the 4 years I had spent as one of his primary caretakers counted for nothing once Jennifer's family entered the picture. The photos came next. Family pictures that had once included me were quietly replaced with new versions that featured Jennifer's extended family. Holiday cards that had traditionally included grandparents from both sides now showcased only one set of grandparents, Jennifer's parents, who lived in a beautiful house with a swimming pool and enough disposable income to shower Tommy with expensive gifts I could never afford. My son began referring to Jennifer's parents as Grandma Susan and Grandpa Bill when talking to Tommy, while I gradually became just Carla in family conversations. The title I had earned through love, sacrifice, and years of devoted service was slowly stripped away and reassigned to people who had the advantage of wealth, availability, and Jennifer's favor. "It's less confusing for him this way," David said, when I finally gathered the courage to ask why Tommy had stopped calling me Grandma. "He was getting mixed up about which grandmother was which, and we thought it would be simpler if he used first names for everyone." But Tommy wasn't confused. He was being taught to see me as something other than family, something less than the woman who had helped raise him. He was learning that love could be conditional, that relationships could be rewritten, that the people who had once been most important in his life could become strangers if the right person decided they were no longer welcome. For months after the systematic exclusion began, I refused to accept what was happening. I told myself that Jennifer was simply adjusting to her role as stepmother, that the schedule conflicts were genuine coincidences, that given time and patience, we would find our rhythm as an extended family. I convinced myself that love would eventually triumph over whatever misunderstandings or territorial instincts were driving these changes. So I tried harder. I showed up earlier to events, stayed later, brought bigger gifts, offered more help. I memorized Tommy's new schedule at his new school, learned the names of his new friends, studied his developing interests so I could engage with him on topics that mattered to him. I thought that if I could just prove how much I cared, how valuable my presence was in his life, the barriers would naturally dissolve. I was wrong. The harder I tried, the more intrusive I appeared to become in Jennifer's carefully constructed narrative. Every gesture of love was reinterpreted as desperation. Every attempt to maintain my relationship with Tommy was framed as an inability to respect boundaries. Every expression of my desire to remain involved in his life became evidence of my selfishness and lack of consideration for his new family dynamic. The Christmas incident was the first time I truly understood the depths of what I was fighting against. I had been looking forward to the holiday for months, carefully selecting and wrapping gifts for Tommy, planning to bake his favorite cookies, hoping that the magic of Christmas might restore some warmth to our relationship. I had specifically asked David about the timing for Christmas morning, wanting to coordinate my visit, so I wouldn't interfere with their plans while still being able to see Tommy open the presents I had chosen with such care. "Come by around 10, David had said. "We'll do presents first thing in the morning, then have breakfast. Then you can visit before we head over to Jennifer's parents' house for dinner." I arrived at exactly 10 o'clock, carrying a bag of carefully wrapped gifts, and wearing the red sweater Tommy had once said made me look like Mrs. Claus. Through the living room window, I could see the family gathered around the Christmas tree: David, Jennifer, Tommy, and Jennifer's parents, who had apparently been invited to share the morning celebration I had thought was reserved for immediate family. I knocked on the front door, my breath creating small clouds in the cold December air, my heart full of anticipation for Tommy's reaction to the remote control car I had saved for months to buy. The door opened, but instead of the warm greeting I had expected, David appeared uncomfortable and unprepared for my arrival. "Oh, Carla," he said, not opening the door fully or inviting me inside. "I thought I told you we were going to do presents later." Behind him, I could hear Tommy's excited voice as he tore through wrapping paper, Jennifer's parents cooing over his reactions, the whole family engaging in the Christmas morning ritual I had shared with them for years before Jennifer's arrival. The Christmas morning that was apparently happening without me, despite the specific time David had given me just days before. "You said 10 o'clock?" I reminded him quietly, my voice barely audible over the sounds of celebration happening just feet away from where I stood excluded on the front porch. "I have Tommy's presents." "Right, yes, but Jennifer's parents surprised us by coming early, and it got a little chaotic, and we decided to just go ahead and do presents while everyone was here." His explanation came out in a rush, the words of someone who knew he was delivering a painful blow but couldn't bring himself to acknowledge its impact. "Maybe you could come back later? This afternoon?" Through the gap in the partially opened door, I caught a glimpse of Tommy surrounded by gifts, his face glowing with the pure joy that Christmas morning brings to children. Jennifer's mother was helping him read cards, her voice carrying the warm affection I had once been able to express freely in this house. Jennifer's father was taking photos, documenting moments that would become family memories I would never be part of. I was watching my grandson's Christmas morning through a crack in a door, like a stranger peering into someone else's happiness. The woman who had once been integral to his holiday celebrations was now an afterthought, someone whose presence needed to be managed and delayed until it was more convenient for the real family to include her. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face in half. "I'll come back later." But later never came. By afternoon, they had left for Jennifer's parents' house, where Tommy would experience his second Christmas celebration of the day, one that would be documented in photo albums and remembered in family stories, while my visit became a footnote, a brief obligation fulfilled between the real celebrations. I spent Christmas afternoon alone in my small apartment, Tommy's unopened presents sitting on my kitchen table like accusations, the remote control car that I had imagined him racing through the house, the book series about dragons that I had chosen because he had mentioned liking fantasy stories, the photo album I had filled with pictures of us together from his first 4 years of life, back when I was still welcome in his world. Each gift represented hours of thought, careful budgeting, hopeful planning for a relationship that was being systematically destroyed, despite my every effort to preserve it. They sat there untouched, symbols of love that had nowhere to go, evidence of a grandmother's devotion to a child who was being taught not to value it. The school play incident was even more devastating. Tommy had been cast as a tree in his second-grade environmental awareness production, a small role, but one he was excited about because it meant wearing a costume his class had made together and speaking 2 lines about the importance of forests. He had practiced his lines for me over the phone during one of our increasingly brief conversations, his pride in his theatrical debut evident in his careful pronunciation of every word. I arranged to take time off work, something that was difficult in my job as a customer service representative but possible with advance notice. I had attended every school event of Tommy's that I could manage since he started kindergarten, sitting in the audience and beaming with grandmother pride as he participated in concerts, science fairs, and classroom presentations. I arrived at the school auditorium 30 minutes early, wanting to secure a seat with a good view of the stage. The auditorium was already filling with parents, grandparents, and siblings, all chattering with anticipation about their young performers. I found a seat in the 3rd row, directly center, where Tommy would be able to see me clearly when he looked out at the audience. As the auditorium continued to fill, I noticed Jennifer and David entering with Jennifer's parents. They scanned the seating area, and I waved to get their attention, gesturing to the empty seats beside me that I had been holding for them. We had always sat together at Tommy's school events, united in our pride for his achievements regardless of whatever tensions existed in our adult relationships. But instead of joining me, they found seats on the opposite side of the auditorium, not just a few rows away, completely across the space, as far from me as possible while still being in the same room. Jennifer's mother leaned over to whisper something to Jennifer, and they both glanced in my direction with expressions I couldn't quite read from that distance. I sat alone in my row as families clustered around me, feeling conspicuous and unwanted in a room full of people celebrating their children. When Tommy appeared on stage in his tree costume, his face scanning the audience for familiar faces, I waved enthusiastically from my seat, but his gaze quickly moved past me to find his father's family on the other side of the room, and his smile was directed toward them. After the performance, as parents and families gathered in the hallway to congratulate their young actors, I approached Tommy with genuine enthusiasm for his performance. "You were wonderful, sweetheart. You remembered both your lines perfectly, and your costume looked amazing." Tommy looked up at me with polite but distant acknowledgement, the kind of response you might give to a family acquaintance, rather than someone who had once been one of your favorite people. "Thanks, Carla," he said, already looking around for more interesting conversations. Jennifer appeared beside him, placing a possessive hand on his shoulder. "Tommy, Grandma Susan brought you flowers," she said, guiding him toward Jennifer's mother, who was indeed holding a small bouquet of roses that made my verbal congratulations seem inadequate and thoughtless. I watched as Tommy hugged Jennifer's mother with genuine affection, accepting her flowers with the kind of gratitude I remembered him showing me in better times. I realized that I had been replaced not just in schedule and title, but in Tommy's heart. The love he had once felt for me was being transferred to someone else, someone who had the advantage of Jennifer's approval and the power to shower him with tokens of affection I couldn't afford. By the spring of Tommy's second-grade year, I had stopped trying to fight the current that was sweeping me away from my grandson's life. The exhaustion of constantly being excluded, diminished and reframed as the problem rather than the victim, had worn down my resistance until acceptance felt easier than struggle. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was the one causing problems by refusing to gracefully step aside and let Jennifer's family become Tommy's real family. The final breaking point came during what should have been one of the happiest days of my life, Tommy's 8th birthday party. Not the party I had attended 6 months later where he wished for my death. That was still in our painful future. This was the party I wasn't invited to at all. I learned about it the way estranged family members often discover important events, through social media. A casual scroll through Facebook while eating my solitary dinner showed me photo after photo of Tommy's celebration. The backyard of David's house decorated with superhero themes, a bounce house I could never afford to rent, a cake shaped like Tommy's favorite video game character, and dozens of children and adults I barely recognized celebrating my grandson's life. There I was, sitting in my small apartment with a wrapped present I had bought weeks in advance, a homemade birthday card where I had written a long message about how proud I was of the young man he was becoming, completely unaware that his party was happening without me. Not postponed, not rescheduled, not conflicted with my availability, simply planned and executed as if I didn't exist. The photos showed Jennifer's parents in prominent positions, helping serve cake, organizing games, taking the role that grandparents typically fill at such celebrations. There were pictures of Tommy hugging other adults I didn't recognize, laughing with children who had apparently become more important to him than the grandmother who once knew his every favorite thing. David hadn't called to tell me about the party. He hadn't sent a text with an excuse about why I couldn't be included. He simply hadn't thought to inform me that my grandson was having a birthday celebration, as if my interest in such an event was so minimal that it didn't warrant consideration. I stared at those photos for hours, zooming in on Tommy's face to see if there was any hint of sadness about my absence, any sign that he had wondered where Grandma Carla was on his special day. But his smile was genuine and complete. He looked like a child who had everything he needed, surrounded by everyone who mattered to him, and I wasn't among them. That night, I did something I had never done in all my years of loving Tommy. I considered giving up entirely. Maybe Jennifer was right. Maybe David was right. Maybe the kindest thing I could do was stop trying to force my way into a life where I was clearly unwanted. Stop causing tension in their family dynamics. Stop making everyone uncomfortable with my persistent need to maintain relationships that had apparently run their natural course. I looked around my small living room, where framed photos of Tommy from his first 4 years of life sat on every surface. Pictures of us baking cookies together, reading stories, playing in the park, building elaborate structures with blocks. Evidence of a relationship that had once been central to both our lives, but now existed only in my memory and these frozen moments. The apartment felt like a shrine to a relationship that was already dead. I was like one of those people who keeps a loved one's room exactly as it was after they die, refusing to accept that the person isn't coming back. Except Tommy wasn't dead. He was simply being raised to see me as irrelevant, and I was clinging to a version of our relationship that no longer existed outside my own desperate hope. I began taking down the photos that night, carefully wrapping each frame in tissue paper and placing them in boxes I stored in my bedroom closet. If I couldn't be part of Tommy's present, at least I could stop torturing myself with reminders of our past. The living room looked stark and unfamiliar without his smiling face looking back at me from every corner, but it also felt more honest. This was my life now. A small apartment with basic furniture and no evidence of the family relationships that had once given my existence meaning and purpose. The calls to David became less frequent, then stopped altogether. What was the point? Every conversation was an exercise in polite rejection, carefully worded explanations for why my presence wasn't wanted or needed at various family events. It was easier to simply stop asking, stop hoping, stop setting myself up for the disappointment that had become the only reliable constant in our interactions. I stopped buying birthday presents in advance, stopped marking school events on my calendar, stopped following David's social media accounts where I would only see evidence of the life they were living without me. I deleted Jennifer's phone number from my contacts, removed Tommy's school information from my address book, and gradually began the process of accepting that my role as a grandmother was over. The loneliness was profound in ways I had never experienced before. I had lost my husband to cancer 5 years earlier, and while that grief was devastating, it was clean and understandable. Death is final, but it doesn't involve choice or rejection. Losing Tommy felt different, like being told that your love wasn't worth preserving, that your place in his life had been evaluated and found unnecessary. Work became my only distraction, and even there I felt like an outsider among colleagues who talked about their grandchildren's achievements, showed photos from family gatherings, and planned vacations around school schedules and visitation arrangements. I had nothing to contribute to these conversations anymore. No updates about Tommy's progress in school, no cute stories about things he had said or done. I was a grandmother without a grandchild, playing a role that no longer had any substance or meaning. The months passed in a blur of routine without joy. I got up, went to work, came home, ate dinner alone, watched television programs that helped me avoid thinking, and went to bed. Weekends stretched endlessly without the structure that Tommy's activities had once provided. Holidays became just days off work rather than opportunities for celebration and family connection. I stopped mentioning Tommy in conversations with friends and neighbors who used to ask about him regularly. When people inquired about my family, I gave vague responses that discouraged further questions. It was easier than explaining that I had been systematically erased from my grandson's life by people who had decided I was expendable. But even in the depths of that resignation, something small and stubborn refused to die completely. During those long, empty evenings, I found myself thinking not just about what I had lost, but about what Tommy was losing too. Jennifer's campaign to replace me hadn't just cost me a relationship I treasured, it had cost Tommy a grandmother who had loved him unconditionally, who remembered his history, who could have offered him perspectives and stories that no one else in his current circle could provide. Late one night, as I sat in my darkened living room unable to sleep, I realized that my withdrawal might feel like relief to Jennifer, and even to David, but it was also a form of abandonment of Tommy. By stepping aside, by accepting the role of expendable family member, I was allowing him to grow up believing that love could be conditional, that family bonds could be severed whenever they became inconvenient, that the people who had once been most important to him could simply disappear without consequence. I began to understand that my fight to remain in Tommy's life wasn't just about my own need for relationship and meaning. It was about what kind of person he would become if he learned that family members could be discarded like outgrown clothing, that love could be withdrawn whenever someone more convenient came along. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't see in my apparent surrender, was that I still had something they had forgotten about, something they couldn't take away or replace or redirect. I had documentation. 3 years of careful notes, saved emails, recorded phone calls, and detailed records of every attempt to exclude me, every broken promise, every incident that revealed the systematic nature of what had been done to our relationship. I had been keeping these records almost unconsciously, initially just trying to track the pattern of exclusions to understand what was happening. But now, in the depths of my despair, I realized they represented something more powerful than evidence of my pain. They were proof of what Tommy was being subjected to, documentation of the emotional manipulation that was reshaping his understanding of family, love, and loyalty. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It wasn't about punishing Jennifer and David. It was about protecting Tommy from learning that the adults in his life could rewrite history, discard inconvenient people, and teach him that love was something to be rationed based on usefulness rather than freely given based on bond and commitment. That night, as I sat surrounded by the silence of my empty apartment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not hope, exactly, but something quieter and more determined. It wasn't the desperate love that had driven my previous attempts to force my way back into Tommy's life. It was something harder and more purposeful. It was decision. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began in the quiet hours after midnight, when I would sit at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that had long gone cold, carefully organizing 3 years' worth of documentation that I had never intended to use as weapons, but now realized might be Tommy's only hope for understanding the truth about his family. I spread the papers across my small dining table like puzzle pieces, each document telling part of a larger story about systematic exclusion and deliberate alienation. There were printed emails where David had promised to include me in events that I later discovered through social media had happened without me. Screenshots of text message conversations where Jennifer had assured me that schedule conflicts were genuine coincidences, alongside photos posted the same day showing carefully planned celebrations I had never been told about. Phone records that showed my attempts to maintain regular contact with Tommy, gradually becoming less frequent as my calls went unreturned and my messages received shorter, more distant responses. Bank statements showing gifts I had purchased for birthdays and holidays that were never acknowledged, never mentioned, as if they had simply vanished into a void of indifference. But the most damning evidence was in my own handwritten notes, detailed records I had kept of conversations, incidents, and observations that revealed the calculated nature of what had been done to our relationship. I had documented everything with the obsessive attention of someone trying to make sense of senseless cruelty, and now those notes told a story that even a family court judge would recognize as parental alienation. I wasn't a lawyer, but I wasn't naive either. During my 23 years as a customer service representative, I had learned to pay attention to patterns, to document problems, to build cases for resolution. I understood bureaucracy, procedure, and the importance of having evidence rather than just emotions when trying to prove that something wrong had been done. My research began at the public library, where I could use the computers for free and access legal databases without anyone questioning what I was looking for. I learned about grandparents' rights, about parental alienation, about the legal remedies available when family relationships were being deliberately sabotaged. The law was more complex than I had expected, but it also offered more protection than I had dared to hope. Colorado had specific statutes addressing grandparent visitation rights, particularly in cases where one parent was actively interfering with previously established relationships. The courts recognized that children benefited from maintaining connections with extended family members who had played significant roles in their lives, and judges had the authority to order visitation even when parents objected. More importantly, I discovered that parental alienation was increasingly being recognized by family courts as a form of emotional abuse, not just of the targeted parent or grandparent, but of the child who was being taught to reject loving relationships based on manipulation rather than genuine grievances. Tommy wasn't just losing his grandmother. He was being damaged by the process that was accomplishing that loss. The legal consultation I finally scheduled cost me $200 I could barely afford, but it was the most hopeful conversation I had experienced in months. Margaret Williams was a family law attorney who specialized in grandparents' rights cases, a woman in her 60s who listened to my story with the attention of someone who had heard variations of it many times before. "You have an exceptionally well-documented case," she said, reviewing the folders of evidence I had brought to her office. "The pattern is clear, the timeline is detailed, and the contrast between your previous relationship with Tommy and your current exclusion is stark enough to meet the legal standard for proving alienation." She explained that we would need to file a petition for grandparent visitation rights, presenting evidence that I had an established relationship with Tommy that was being unreasonably interfered with by his custodial parent. The court would appoint a guardian ad litem to represent Tommy's interests independently of what his father and stepmother claimed he wanted. "Children who have been subjected to alienation campaigns often express hostility toward the targeted family member," Margaret explained. "But the courts understand that these feelings may not reflect the child's authentic emotions or best interests. A qualified evaluator will be able to distinguish between genuine preference and manufactured rejection. The process would take months, possibly longer. There would be home visits, psychological evaluations, interviews with Tommy conducted by trained professionals who understood how to identify coaching and manipulation. It wouldn't be easy, and there were no guarantees about the outcome. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had allies who understood what had been done to Tommy and to me. I wasn't a desperate grandmother begging for scraps of attention from people who saw me as inconvenient. I was a plaintiff with rights that could be legally enforced, with evidence that could be independently evaluated, with advocates who were professionally obligated to fight for my case, rather than simply managing my emotions. I signed the retainer agreement that afternoon, using money from my emergency savings that I had been carefully guarding since my husband's death. This wasn't the kind of emergency I had anticipated when I set aside those funds, but protecting my relationship with Tommy qualified as the most important crisis I would ever face. The first legal document was filed 2 weeks later, a petition requesting court-ordered visitation between Tommy and me, based on the established relationship that had existed for the first 5 years of his life, and the documented interference that had eliminated my access to him. David and Jennifer would receive official notice that they were being sued, that their treatment of me was now subject to judicial review, that they would need to defend their actions in front of a judge who had the authority to override their preferences. I didn't tell them it was coming. After 3 years of trying to reason with them, negotiate with them, beg them for basic consideration, I had learned that they only understood authority that they couldn't dismiss or manipulate. A court summons would communicate in ways that my maternal heartbreak had failed to accomplish. The night after the papers were served, David called me for the first time in 4 months. His voice was angry, confused, and slightly afraid. Emotions I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager who had gotten caught doing something he knew was wrong. "What the hell are you doing, Mom?" he demanded, without even the courtesy of a greeting. "You're suing us? You're actually taking us to court because we don't include you in every single thing we do with Tommy." I had imagined this conversation dozens of times, rehearsed different responses, planned various approaches to help him understand what he had allowed to happen to our family. But now that the moment had arrived, I found myself surprisingly calm. "I'm not suing you because you don't include me in everything," I said quietly. "I'm suing you because you don't include me in anything, because you've allowed your wife to systematically destroy the relationship between Tommy and his grandmother, because Tommy has been taught to see my death as a birthday gift, and you stood there and laughed." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When David finally spoke again, his voice was defensive but less aggressive. "Tommy didn't mean that. It was just kid talk. He doesn't understand what he was saying. 7-year-olds understand death, David. They understand love and rejection and family bonds. What they don't understand is why the adults in their lives sometimes teach them to hate people who have only ever loved them." I could hear Jennifer's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out her words. David's responses were muffled, as if he had covered the phone while they discussed strategy. When he came back on the line, his tone had shifted to something that might have been pleading if it hadn't been wrapped in such obvious manipulation. "Look, Mom, this doesn't have to get ugly. We can work something out. Maybe we could do better about including you. But going to court, getting lawyers involved, dragging Tommy through legal proceedings, that's not going to help anyone." But I was no longer the desperate woman who had spent 3 years accepting crumbs of attention and being grateful for minimal consideration. The legal process had already begun changing the power dynamic between us, giving me a platform where my rights mattered as much as their preferences. "It's too late for working something out, David," I said, and I meant it. Tommy deserves better than parents who teach him that family love is conditional, that people who sacrifice for you can be discarded when they become inconvenient. And I deserve better than spending what's left of my life begging for permission to love my grandson. Not revenge, not punishment, just truth, presented by people with the professional training and legal authority to recognize it when they saw it. The weeks following my phone call with David passed with an eerie sense of anticipation, like the stillness that settles over a landscape before a thunderstorm breaks. I continued my daily routine: work, grocery shopping, paying bills. But everything felt different now that I had legal proceedings moving forward on my behalf. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't the only one fighting for my relationship with Tommy. Margaret Williams called me regularly with updates that felt like small victories after so many months of powerlessness. The court had assigned a guardian ad litem to represent Tommy's interests independently of what David and Jennifer claimed he wanted. Dr. Patricia Hoffman was a child psychologist with extensive experience in parental alienation cases, someone trained to recognize the difference between a child's authentic feelings and responses that had been coached or manipulated. Dr. Hoffman will be conducting several interviews with Tommy over the next few weeks, Margaret explained during one of our phone conversations. She'll also be interviewing you, David, Jennifer, and potentially some collateral witnesses who can speak to your historical relationship with Tommy. Her report will be crucial in determining the court's final decision. I spent hours preparing for my interview with Dr. Hoffman, not because I intended to lie or manipulate the process, but because I wanted to present the truth as clearly and completely as possible. I organized photo albums that documented my relationship with Tommy from birth through age 5, gathering evidence of the bond we had shared before Jennifer's systematic campaign to eliminate me from his life. The photos told a story that words alone couldn't convey. Here was Tommy at 6 months old, falling asleep in my arms while I rocked him during one of my regular babysitting evenings. Here he was at 18 months, covered in flour after we had attempted to bake cookies together, both of us laughing at the mess we had created. His second birthday party, where I was prominently featured in nearly every photo, helping him blow out candles and opening presents with the excitement that grandparents bring to such celebrations. Third birthday, fourth birthday, fifth birthday, each year documented with clear evidence that I had been central to Tommy's life during his early childhood. Then the photos stopped abruptly, replaced by social media screenshots showing celebrations that had happened without me. A visual representation of how completely I had been erased from his world. Dr. Hoffman's office was in a professional building that smelled like carpet cleaner and fresh paint, designed to be neutral and non-threatening for the children and families who came there during difficult times. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who had spent decades listening to family conflicts and trying to protect children from the damage that adult dysfunction could cause. "Tell me about your relationship with Tommy before his father remarried," she said, settling back in her chair with a notepad and the unhurried manner of someone prepared to listen for as long as necessary. I found myself talking for nearly 2 hours, describing not just the activities Tommy and I had shared, but the quality of our connection, how he had run to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings, how he had insisted on calling me before bedtime when he was staying overnight with his mother, how he had saved his artwork from school to show me, proud of my reactions to his creative efforts. He trusted me with his emotions in ways that felt precious, I told her. When he was afraid of monsters under his bed, when he was worried about starting kindergarten, When his parents were fighting during the divorce, I was someone he could talk to who wasn't directly involved in the conflict. I represented stability and unconditional love in a world that sometimes felt uncertain to him. Dr. Hoffman asked detailed questions about the changes that had occurred after Jennifer entered the picture, and I was able to provide specific examples rather than general complaints. The Christmas morning exclusion, the birthday party I learned about through social media, the school play where I sat alone while Jennifer's family was treated as Tommy's real grandparents. Can you describe Tommy's demeanor toward you during your most recent interactions? She asked. This was the most painful part of the conversation, but also the most important. He's become polite but distant, like I'm a family acquaintance rather than someone who helped raise him. There's no warmth, no genuine connection, no evidence that he remembers or values our previous relationship. But what's most concerning is that he's learned to see me as someone who causes problems for his family rather than someone who loves him. I told her about the birthday party where he had wished for my death, about the way the adults had laughed as if his cruel words were amusing rather than heartbreaking evidence of successful alienation. Children don't naturally wish death upon people who have only shown them love, I said. That level of hostility has to be taught, reinforced and rewarded by the adults they depend on for emotional guidance. Dr. Hoffman's expression remained professionally neutral, but I could see her taking detailed notes about everything I described. This was clearly not the first case of grandparent alienation she had evaluated, and she seemed to recognize patterns that I had been too close to the situation to identify on my own. Meanwhile, my legal case was creating ripple effects in David and Jennifer's carefully constructed world that I only learned about later. Jennifer's attempts to present their exclusion of me as reasonable boundary setting were being challenged by neutral professionals who understood family dynamics and child psychology. Their narrative that I was an intrusive, demanding grandmother who couldn't accept their new family structure was being evaluated by people trained to recognize manipulation and emotional abuse. David's coworkers and friends were apparently asking questions about why he was being sued by his own mother, forcing him to explain family dynamics that probably sounded less reasonable when described to outsiders than they had seemed within the echo chamber of his home. Jennifer's parents, who had been happy to replace me as Tommy's primary grandparents, were now potentially facing questions about their role in alienating a child from his paternal grandmother. Most importantly, Tommy was being interviewed by someone whose professional obligation was to his well-being rather than his parents' preferences. Dr. Hoffman's sessions with him would reveal whether his expressed hostility toward me was genuine or coached, whether he actually remembered our previous relationship, whether he understood the full picture of what had happened to our family. I received copies of the initial reports that David and Jennifer had submitted to the court, documents that attempted to justify their exclusion of me by portraying me as unstable, demanding, and potentially harmful to Tommy's emotional well-being. According to their version of events, I had never been as important to Tommy as I claimed, had been difficult to work with during David's first marriage, and had become increasingly problematic after Jennifer joined the family. Reading their characterization of me as a threat to Tommy's well-being felt like being slapped, but it also clarified exactly what I was fighting against. They had created a completely fictional version of our family history, one where my devotion to Tommy was reframed as obsession, my attempts to maintain our relationship were described as harassment, and my pain at being excluded was presented as evidence of my emotional instability. But fiction couldn't stand up to documentation. My 3 years of careful record-keeping, my photos and emails and detailed notes, told a different story than the one they had presented to the court. The contrast between my evidence and their claims was stark enough that even a judge who had never met any of us would be able to see the truth. 3 weeks after my interview with Dr. Hoffman, Margaret called with news that made my heart race with anticipation and anxiety. "The court has scheduled a hearing for next month," she said. "Dr. Hoffman's preliminary report supports your position, and the judge wants to hear testimony from all parties before making a decision about visitation rights." A hearing meant that David and Jennifer would have to defend their actions under oath in front of a judge who had the authority to overrule their preferences. It meant that Tommy's welfare would be evaluated by professionals whose only concern was his best interests rather than adult convenience. It meant that after 3 years of being powerless against their systematic campaign to erase me from his life, I would finally have advocates with the legal authority to enforce justice. The hearing was still weeks away, but I could already feel something changing in the dynamic between David and me. His phone calls became more frequent, his tone more conciliatory. Jennifer, who had refused to speak to me directly for over 2 years, suddenly began sending text messages suggesting that we might be able to work something out without involving the courts further. But it was too late for private negotiations and family compromises. Tommy deserved more than whatever minimal visitation they might offer to avoid judicial scrutiny of their behavior. He deserved the truth about his family history, protection from further alienation, and the opportunity to rebuild the relationship with his grandmother that had been so deliberately destroyed. I wasn't seeking revenge against David and Jennifer. I was seeking justice for Tommy, who had been taught to hate someone who had only ever loved him. The difference between those two goals would become clear to everyone when we finally stood before a judge who understood that children's emotional well-being mattered more than adults' territorial preferences. The calm before the storm was ending. Soon, the truth would finally have its day in court. The morning of the court hearing, I woke before my alarm with the kind of nervous energy that comes when everything you've fought for hangs in the balance of a single day. I had laid out my clothes the night before. A navy blue dress that conveyed respectability without ostentation, low heels that would allow me to walk confidently, and the simple gold necklace my late husband had given me for our 20th anniversary. I wanted to look like the loving grandmother I was, not the unstable troublemaker David and Jennifer had portrayed in their court filings. Margaret had prepared me extensively for what to expect, but nothing could have fully readied me for the surreal experience of sitting in a courtroom while my family relationships were dissected by strangers. The room was smaller than I had imagined, with fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows and wooden benches that looked like church pews, but felt far less welcoming. David and Jennifer sat at the defendant's table with their attorney, a sharp-dressed man in his 40s who had apparently specialized in defending parents against grandparents' rights claims. Jennifer wore a conservative black suit that made her look professional and maternal, while David had chosen the kind of outfit he typically wore to important business meetings, projecting success and stability. They looked like the perfect young family being harassed by an unreasonable older woman who couldn't accept her diminished role in their lives. Without context, without evidence, without the detailed documentation I had spent 3 years compiling, their version of events might have seemed plausible to an outside observer. But Judge Patricia Reeves had read Dr. Hoffman's report, had reviewed my evidence, and had 22 years of experience distinguishing between legitimate family boundary issues and cases of systematic alienation. She was a woman in her late 50s with graying hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had presided over too many family conflicts to be easily manipulated by surface appearances. Dr. Hoffman was called as the first witness, and her testimony was devastating to David and Jennifer's case. She had conducted 4 separate interviews with Tommy, using play therapy techniques and indirect questioning methods that revealed far more than direct interrogation would have accomplished. In my professional opinion, Dr. Hoffman testified, speaking directly to Judge Reeves with the authority of someone who had evaluated hundreds of similar cases. Tommy Morrison has been subjected to a systematic campaign of parental alienation, designed to sever his emotional connection to his paternal grandmother. His expressed hostility toward Mrs. Morrison is inconsistent with his documented previous relationship with her and shows clear signs of coaching and manipulation. She described how Tommy had initially been unable to remember specific negative experiences with me, only general statements that he had been bad and mean to his family. When pressed for details, he had provided inconsistent stories that changed with each telling, suggesting they were fabricated rather than based on genuine memories. Most tellingly, Dr. Hoffman continued, when I showed Tommy photographs of himself with Mrs. Morrison from his early childhood, his demeanor changed completely. He became quiet, almost sad, and asked why he didn't see Grandma Carla anymore. The emotional response was genuine in a way that his rehearsed hostility was not. Margaret then presented my evidence methodically, building a timeline that showed the systematic nature of my exclusion. Email exchanges where Jennifer had assured me that schedule conflicts were accidental, followed by social media posts proving they were deliberate. Phone records showing my attempts to maintain contact becoming less frequent as my calls went unreturned. Photos documenting my central role in Tommy's first 5 years, contrasted with complete absence from his life after Jennifer's arrival. When it was David's turn to testify, I watched my son struggle to defend actions that looked indefensible under judicial scrutiny. His attorney had clearly prepared him to emphasize Jennifer's rights as Tommy's stepmother, and my supposed inability to respect their family boundaries. "My mother has always been intense," David said, not meeting my eyes as he spoke. "After Jennifer and I married, she had trouble accepting that our family dynamic had changed. She would show up uninvited, call constantly, and make Jennifer uncomfortable in her own home." But Margaret was ready for this line of defense, presenting evidence that contradicted each of David's claims. Phone records showing that my calls had been frequent only during periods when David had specifically asked me to check on Tommy's well-being. Documentation proving that I had never shown up uninvited, but had been explicitly told I was welcome at events that were then moved or canceled without notification. "Mr. Morrison," Margaret said during cross-examination, "can you explain why your mother was included in family photos and celebrations consistently for the first 4 years of Tommy's life, then completely excluded after your marriage to Jennifer, if her behavior had always been problematic?" David's answer was halting and unconvincing, full of pauses and contradictions that made it clear he was trying to justify the unjustifiable. He couldn't explain why a grandmother who had been central to his son's life had suddenly become too disruptive to include in birthday parties and school events. Jennifer's testimony was even more damaging to their case. She had clearly rehearsed her performance, presenting herself as a reasonable stepmother who had tried to include me but had been forced to establish boundaries due to my inappropriate behavior. "Mrs. Morrison seemed to resent my relationship with Tommy," Jennifer said with practiced concern. "She would undermine my authority as his stepmother and make comments that suggested she didn't think I was good enough for David or for Tommy. It became necessary to limit her access to protect our family's emotional well-being." But Jennifer's polished presentation fell apart when Margaret began questioning her about specific incidents. She couldn't provide details about the undermining behavior she claimed I had exhibited. She couldn't explain why protecting Tommy's emotional well-being required completely eliminating his relationship with a grandmother who had never been anything but loving toward him. Most devastatingly, she couldn't justify the systematic replacement of my role with her own parents, the deliberate exclusion from events I had historically attended, or the failure to even inform me about Tommy's birthday celebration. "Mrs. Morrison," Margaret said, presenting the social media photos from Tommy's 8th birthday party, "can you explain how completely excluding Tommy's paternal grandmother from his birthday celebration protected his emotional well-being?" Jennifer's composure cracked for the first time during her testimony. We didn't think she would want to come. She had been so negative about our family events. But you didn't ask her whether she wanted to come, did you? You simply planned and executed the celebration without informing her it was happening. We thought it would be less stressful for Tommy if—" Jennifer's response trailed off because there was no reasonable explanation for what they had done. No amount of preparation could make parental alienation look like protective parenting when examined by professionals trained to recognize the difference. The hearing lasted 6 hours, with testimony from character witnesses who spoke to my previous relationship with Tommy, experts who explained the psychological damage that alienation campaigns cause to children, and additional evidence that painted a clear picture of systematic emotional manipulation. When Judge Reeves finally called for a recess before delivering her ruling, I felt simultaneously exhausted and hopeful. The truth had been presented clearly and completely. The evidence spoke for itself. After 3 years of being powerless against Jennifer's campaign to erase me from Tommy's life, I had finally been heard by someone with the authority to enforce justice. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened when court reconvened 30 minutes later. "After reviewing all the evidence presented today," Judge Reeves began, "I find clear and convincing proof that Tommy Morrison has been subjected to parental alienation designed to sever his relationship with his paternal grandmother. This court will not allow a child to be emotionally manipulated for the territorial convenience of adults who should be protecting his best interests rather than serving their own preferences. She ordered immediate reinstatement of my visitation rights, including overnight visits, participation in school events, and regular access to Tommy without interference from David or Jennifer. More importantly, she ordered family counseling to help repair the damage that had been done to our relationship and to ensure that no further alienation would be tolerated. Mr. Morrison and Mrs. Morrison, Judge Reeves continued, looking directly at David and Jennifer, any future interference with the court-ordered relationship between Tommy and his grandmother will result in contempt charges and potential modification of custody arrangements. This child deserves the love and support of his extended family, and this court will not allow that to be taken from him based on adult jealousy and territorial behavior. The gavel came down with a sound that seemed to echo through the courtroom and through my heart. After 3 years of systematic exclusion, rejection, and emotional manipulation, justice had finally spoken with authority that couldn't be dismissed or negotiated away. The first court-ordered visitation happened 2 weeks after Judge Reeves delivered her ruling. I stood on the front porch of David's house, the same porch where I had been excluded from Tommy's Christmas morning 3 years earlier. But this time, I carried legal authority instead of desperate hope. This time, no one could close the door in my face or reschedule my grandson's life around my absence. Tommy came to the door slowly, his 8-year-old frame smaller than I remembered, his eyes carrying uncertainty that broke my heart. The hostile child who had wished for my death at his birthday party was gone, replaced by a confused little boy who had been told by a court-appointed therapist that the grandmother he had been taught to reject was actually someone who loved him deeply. "Hi, Tommy," I said softly, kneeling down to his eye level the way I used to when he was smaller. "I've missed you so much." He looked back at Jennifer, who stood in the doorway with barely contained anger, then at David, who couldn't meet my eyes. The adults who had spent 3 years coaching him to see me as the enemy were now required by law to encourage a relationship they had worked so hard to destroy. "I brought something for you," I said, pulling out a small wrapped package. Inside was a photo album, not the one filled with our early memories that might overwhelm him, but a new one with pictures of the gifts I had bought for birthdays and Christmases that had never been acknowledged. Evidence of a grandmother who had never stopped loving him, even when he had been taught to hate her. "I got these for you," I explained as we sat on the front steps together, away from the toxic atmosphere of the house, "for your 6th birthday, your 7th birthday, last Christmas. I kept them hoping that someday we could be together again." Tommy turned the pages slowly, his small fingers tracing the images of toys and books and clothes I had chosen specifically for him. "Why didn't I get them?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that sounded like the little boy I remembered, curious and innocent, rather than coached and hostile. "Because some adults made bad choices," I said carefully, following the guidelines Dr. Hoffman had given me about not directly criticizing his parents while still telling age-appropriate truth. But now we have a chance to start over, to remember how much we love each other. The healing didn't happen overnight. 3 years of systematic alienation couldn't be undone with a single conversation or even a series of visits. But slowly, carefully, with the help of family therapy sessions that Judge Reeves had mandated, Tommy began to remember who I was before Jennifer had rewritten our history. During our 3rd visit, as we played with blocks in my living room, the same blocks we had used to build elaborate castles when he was 4, he looked up at me with eyes that held recognition rather than wariness. "I remember this," he said quietly. "We used to make towers that reached the ceiling." "We did," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "You were always so creative, so proud when we finished building something together." "Why did I forget?" he asked. And the question cut through me because it revealed how completely Jennifer's campaign had succeeded in erasing our bond from his conscious memory. "Sometimes when families get complicated, children get confused about relationships," I said, using language the therapist had approved. "But the love was always there, Tommy. Even when you couldn't remember it, even when adults told you different stories, the love never went away." By our 6th visit, he was calling me Grandma Carla again instead of just Carla. By our 10th visit, He was hugging me goodbye and asking when he would see me next. By our 15th visit, he was sharing stories about school and friends and the normal childhood experiences I had been excluded from for 3 terrible years. The breakthrough came during a family therapy session in Dr. Hoffman's office, where Tommy was finally encouraged to express his real feelings about our relationship, instead of the coached responses he had been trained to provide. "I was sad when Grandma Carla stopped coming to my house," he said, his 8-year-old honesty cutting through years of adult manipulation. "But Jennifer said she didn't want to see me anymore because I was bad." The silence in the room was profound as the adults processed a child's authentic memory, breaking through the lies that had been constructed around it. Tommy hadn't rejected me. He had been told that I had rejected him, that his behavior had driven away someone who had once been central to his world. Dr. Hoffman used this revelation to help Tommy understand that the adults in his life had made mistakes, that his feelings of loss and confusion had been normal responses to an abnormal situation created by people who should have been protecting his relationships rather than destroying them. 6 months after Judge Reeves's ruling, Tommy spent his first overnight visit at my apartment since he was 5 years old. We made pancakes for breakfast, went to the park where we had played when he was younger, and read stories together on my couch. He fell asleep in my arms while I was reading to him, and I sat there for an hour just holding him, marveling at the miracle of having my grandson back. "Grandma Carla," he said sleepily, as I was tucking him into the guest bed I had prepared with new sheets and his favorite stuffed animal. "I love you." "I love you too, sweetheart," I whispered, kissing his forehead the way I had when he was small. "I never stopped loving you, not for a single day." The court-ordered counseling sessions gradually revealed the full extent of what Jennifer had done to manipulate Tommy's understanding of our relationship. She had told him that I didn't want to see him anymore because he had been too much trouble. She had claimed that I had criticized her parenting and tried to turn him against her. She had systematically replaced every positive memory he had of me with manufactured grievances that explained why his loving grandmother had supposedly abandoned him. But children are resilient, and love is stronger than lies when given the opportunity to flourish again. With professional help, honest conversations, and consistent proof that I had never stopped caring about him, Tommy began to understand that he had been caught in the middle of adult conflicts that had nothing to do with his worthiness of love. David's relationship with me remained strained, and I suspected it always would be. A grown man who allows his wife to systematically destroy his child's relationship with his grandmother has revealed something fundamental about his character that can't be easily forgiven or forgotten. But for Tommy's sake, we maintained civility during exchanges and family therapy sessions. Jennifer's hostility toward me never completely disappeared, but it was now contained by legal boundaries and professional oversight. She couldn't exclude me from school events, couldn't reschedule family celebrations to avoid my presence, couldn't poison Tommy's mind with lies about my feelings toward him. The court order had removed her power to control my relationship with my grandson. 1 year after that devastating birthday party where Tommy had wished for my death, we celebrated his 9th birthday together. This time, I was included in the planning, invited to the celebration, and welcomed as an important part of his life. When he opened my gift, a book series about dragons that I had remembered him mentioning in our early visits, he hugged me with genuine enthusiasm. "This is perfect, Grandma Carla," he said, and his joy was authentic rather than performed. "Will you read the first one with me?" "Of course, sweetheart," I said, looking around at the other adults who had once found his cruelty toward me amusing. Now they watched us with the careful attention of people who understood they were being monitored, that any attempt to interfere with our restored relationship would have legal consequences. That night, as I drove home from the party with a slice of birthday cake and a heart full of gratitude, I reflected on the journey that had brought us back to each other. It hadn't been about revenge against David and Jennifer, though they had certainly faced consequences for their actions. It had been about refusing to allow love to be defeated by manipulation, about protecting a child from learning that family bonds could be severed by adult jealousy and territorial behavior. I had learned something important during those 3 years of systematic exclusion and the legal battle that followed. Sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones who hurt you deepest. But sometimes fighting for what's right requires you to love someone enough to take action. they won't understand or appreciate until much later. Tommy would grow up knowing that his grandmother had fought for him when he couldn't fight for himself, that love had been stronger than lies, that justice existed even when it took time to arrive. Most importantly, he would carry the knowledge that family bonds, once broken by manipulation and deceit, could be healed through patience, truth, and the unwavering commitment of people who understood that children deserve better than the emotional warfare of adults. As I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot, I smiled thinking about our plans for the weekend. Tommy had asked if we could bake cookies together, something we hadn't done since he was 5. I had already bought all the ingredients, prepared my kitchen, and cleared my schedule for an afternoon of flower-covered counters and 8-year-old laughter. I learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with anger or vengeance, but with quiet determination and faith that truth will eventually triumph over lies. Love had won, justice had been served, and my grandson was coming home to a relationship that should never have been taken from either of us. The silence that had once hurt so deeply had finally been broken by voices that mattered. A judge who understood family law, a therapist who recognized emotional manipulation, and eventually, an 8-year-old boy who remembered that his grandma Carla had never stopped loving him.